Chad Daybell was convicted on all counts. So he was convicted of murdering his wife. He was convicted of murdering JJ, and he was convicted of murdering Tylee, plus a whole bunch of insurance fraud. There were 9 counts against him, and it was a unanimous verdict. So,
and no one was surprised.
No one was surprised. So this trial began on April 1st. It is now the 31st of May, so we have been in trial for literally about 9 weeks at this point in time.
2 solid months.
2 solid months. The first week was jury selection, and then, it was testimony and everything. The verdict came down yesterday. Now, there have been a couple of interesting things. I'm going to talk about the verdict, and then I'll talk about the sentencing phase that happened today. And then I'm just have a few side notes on things that I have found interesting here and there.
Okay.
So the jury got the case yesterday. Well, they finished closing arguments and instructions to the jury on Wednesday. And so at that point in time, the jury became sequestered. And so every night the jury was allowed to go home up until the time they started deliberations, so they were given the case. So Wednesday night, they got sequestered. They spent the night in a hotel. They got up Thursday morning. They started deliberating. It took them 6 hours to reach a verdict, which I thought was pretty quick. I didn't know if we'd have a verdict on Thursday.
Lori's, how fast was Lori's? Hers was really fast.
Hers was really fast too. But hers didn't have any defense. At least John Pryor put on a defense. And so I was kind of surprised at how quickly the verdicts came back, given literally the mountains and truckloads of evidence that was presented to that jury. I think the prosecution had almost 70 witnesses over the course of several months. And the defense had maybe about 8 or 10 witnesses. I didn't keep track. Anyway, so the verdict comes back. He's guilty. And then because this is a death penalty case, they do not release the jury, and they immediately go into what's called the sentencing phase, because the jury has to determine, is he going to get sentenced to death for his crimes?
Oh, I didn't realize the jury was deciding that too.
The jury is deciding that. So the jury decides if he's going to spend life in prison or if he's going to get the death penalty. Normally in Idaho, a judge does all of the sentencing, and juries do not do sentencing unless it is a capital case, and death penalty is considered a capital case. So that's why there was a sentencing phase. So the judge gave the jury a lot of instructions yesterday. They were still sequestered. And so they went back to the hotel last night. So this morning, they didn't start taking testimony in the sentencing phase till it was pretty late in the morning, like 10:45, almost 11 o'clock. I understand that maybe they had some sort of technical difficulties in getting the equipment up and going, is kind of what I understood. So for the sentencing phase, what the prosecution does is they bring in victims, and victims get to make a victim impact statement. So we saw and heard from I shouldn't say we saw, because in Idaho, if you are a victim of a crime, they will not post your face in the courtroom feed. So you can hear what the victim's saying, but you cannot see their face. They turn the camera. So we heard from a litany of witnesses, some of which we've heard before, some of which we hadn't. We, of course, heard from Kay Woodcock, who is J.J. Vallow's grandmother. We heard a lot of witnesses from Tammy Douglas Daybell's family.
Right.
Her father came. He was one of the first witnesses to give a victim impact statement. His was very short and sweet. It wasn't very long. Several of her brothers, her sister-in-law gave a victim impact statement. There were 2 of her siblings that just, my heart just was wrenching for them when they were testifying. Her sister, Samantha Gwilliam, that's her only sister. There were 3 brothers, 2 sisters. They were very, very, very close. And she gave a very impassioned victim impact statement talking about just the impact that this has had on her personally, the impact that this has had on her family, all sorts of things, and just how awful this has been. And then her oldest brother, who I believe is named Michael or Matthew Douglas. I missed his first name. I know it started with an M. I thought it was Matthew, but then I saw something later today that maybe it was Mike. Anyway, he's the oldest sibling, and he got up and testified about how gut-wrenching this has been for him as an older brother, not being able to protect his little sister, and just how it has impacted him emotionally. It impacted him at work. just impacted like every aspect of his life as this horrific crime unfolded. Then, of course, there was Tylee Ryan's aunt who testified, and then Lori Vallow's son, Ryan, testified. We've heard from him before. So it was about 1:30, 1:40, about 1:30 when the prosecution finished up with all of the victim impact statements. Then at that point in time, Chad was given the opportunity to do what's called an allocution. Chad could speak to the members of the jury if he wanted to. Now, you recall, Lori spoke with the judge,
and that was cuckoo. Crazy.
It was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs crazy. You know, she was just like, yeah, I didn't do anything wrong. I don't know what the problem is. I mean, just out of just nutso. He chose not to make any statement.
Okay.
And John Pryor does not have the opportunity to bring his kids in to make any sort of statement to say, hey, don't put my dad to death. I suppose they could have made a statement through the prosecution because technically they're victims. I don't know if the prosecution would have let him make a statement if they're saying, don't put my dad to death. He didn't do anything.
So do you think that's unusual for him to not say anything? It probably goes both ways a lot. Huh?
Yeah. I mean, he's maintained his innocence this whole time.
So he's not going to all of a sudden flip and be like, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to lead everybody down the wrong path. So then about 2:00, the case goes to the jury to decide death penalty. Now, with how quickly they came back with their verdict of guilty, I thought, I had placed a bet by 4:00 we'd have a sentencing verdict.
Especially up against the weekend.
Exactly.
They want to go home.
Exactly. They've been there for a long time. They're now sequestered in a hotel. And 4:00 came and went. That was my guess. And there was no verdict.
Nothing.
5:00 came and went. 6:00. I mean, I am just continually refreshing my phone going, when are they going to have a verdict? Finally at 7:50. So they've been deliberating for 6 hours. They've been deliberating this sentencing phase just as long as they've been deliberating the guilty phase. Finally, at 7:50, they say, yeah, we're going to go to the hotel for the night and we will resume again tomorrow morning. So
I hadn't heard that. So
yes.
So they can pick it up tomorrow morning. They don't have to take the weekend off.
No, well, if they took the weekend off, they'd be stuck in the hotel.
Right.
Because they're not allowed, because they're sequestered at this point in time, to go home.
Right. So they'll go back tomorrow. Everybody has to go back.
Everybody has to go back tomorrow, which means the judge goes back. The lawyers are all there. All of the victims who are in the courtroom waiting to hear this are there. The court reporter, everybody who is there all day.
So it'll definitely happen tomorrow, right? It won't go into Sunday, will it?
I don't think it will go into Sunday. If they have a full day of deliberation tomorrow and they still haven't reached a verdict, because they have two choices. They can either find that there's a whole bunch of different mitigating their circumstances. I was going to read it here. They can impose the death sentence if they find that the crimes were especially deprived, heinous, or cruel, or that they meet one of the other aggravating factors detailed in state law. And so if they find that the crimes meet those, then they can impose the death penalty. If they find that the crimes don't meet those, then the fallback is life in prison. So anyway, here's my theory.
That's probably really hard.
Yeah, this is Tiffany 101. Again, when we get interviews with the jurors after this is all over with, because I'm sure at least one of the interviewers or one of the jurors will likely get interviewed by Nate Eaton from East Idaho News. I am guessing one or two of those jurors is having a really hard time imposing the death penalty. And I bet there are several jurors who are very passionate about this. If there was ever a case for the death penalty, this is a case for the death penalty.
And it has to be unanimous?
It has to be unanimous. So
interesting.
It's
probably a lot easier to say he's guilty than to be like, well, now I have to decide what to do with him.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to do that.
Exactly.
Well,
so
some people want it.
Yeah, you read the online comments. There's a lot of people who take him out and shoot him tomorrow, voluntarily. So that's kind of what I'm thinking is I'm thinking there's one or two holdouts that are having a hard time probably imposing the death penalty. And that's where they're at. And how that plays out, I don't know. It very well could be. They were probably smart to quit when they did today. Everybody, it's been a long couple of days. They can go back to the hotel. They can get a good night's rest. Things do always look different in the morning. So
what happens if they can't agree?
I think if they can't
Does the
agree,
judge break the tie? Or
I think if they can't agree, then it goes to life in prison.
Oh, okay.
Because they all have to unanimously
Oh,
agree
okay.
to the
That
death
makes
penalty.
sense.
And
Yeah.
if they have reached an impasse where they're not going to all unanimously agree to impose the death penalty, then he gets life in prison. So anyway,
Okay.
so it in some ways it wouldn't surprise me if we have a verdict within the first couple of hours tomorrow, just because, you know, sometimes you just need a good night's sleep and
Right.
just to clear your head. And you
Yeah.
wake up in the morning, you're like, okay, this is where we
You
can
feel
go.
more confident making a
Yeah.
decision. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
Interesting.
And the other interesting thing about these victim impact statements is there's no cross-examination. They simply get to make their statement. Now, they can't say in their statement, hey, I think you should give him the death penalty. What they are allowed to say in their statement is, here is how this crime has impacted me. And they can talk about the emotional impact, the physical impact, the family relationship impact, just any negative associated with this crime and how it has impacted them. What's been really interesting in listening to these victims is there is such a division in the family. And here's where the battle lines are drawn. You have Chad's 5 kids that are still solidly in Camp Chad. He didn't do this. My mother died of natural causes. He didn't know anything about the kids.
He doesn't have one kid who's jumped ship?
He does not, to this point that we are aware of, have one kid that has jumped ship.
That was the most wild thing. That was the most wild thing to me. Like when his kids took the stand, and I was like, how are they still on board?
Again, I want to deep dive this for a minute here, because I have a lot of thoughts on this. So he's got these 5 kids that are solidly in Camp Chad. At this point in time, no one else is in Camp Chad. The only group in Camp Chad is his kids. And what that has done is that has caused a division among all of the extended family members. So, for example, Samantha Gawilliam, Tammy's sister, when Tammy and Chad lived in Springville, they lived very close to each other. I think they saw each other every day. If not saw each other, they talked to each other every day. They were very, very, very close. And basically raised each other's kids. I mean, they had kids about the same the same age, and they were constantly, babysitting for each other, going to different events, etc. Those kids, Chad's kids now are not having any contact with anybody in Tammy's family, not with their cousins, not with their aunts and uncles, not even with their grandparents. In fact, the grandmother, Tammy's mother, passed away just within a week or so after Lori Vallow was convicted last year. And Chad Daybell's kids did not even attend the funeral for their grandmother.
Wow.
Now, there was talk that maybe they participated or watched it online, but they have just cut off communication with that particular family, that side of the family. It has divided Chad's relatives as well.
Like his siblings?
And I think his parents have maybe come around at this point in time. There was a witness that testified. When did she testify? She testified at the beginning of May, because I did not hear her testimony. It was when I was in Utah for my daughter's graduation. So I had to go back and listen to it. Her name is Heather Daybell, and she is married to one of Chad's brothers. Now, she and his brother Matt, they all grew up in Springville. That's where she knew Chad's family very well. That's where she met Matt in high school. After they got married, they decided that they kind of wanted to move away, and they moved to Rexburg. They wanted to kind of be out on their own. And she said, Chad just really never gave me the warm and fuzzies. And there were some things about his family that caused her, some concern. She didn't like how the boys treated their mother. She thought there was a lot of disrespect. If there were ever marital issues, it seemed to always be the wives. The husbands were perfect. It was all on the wives. So they moved to Rexburg. They start their own life in Rexburg. Chad starts getting involved with Julie Rowe and all this life after death stuff, and he's making all of these prophecies. And Heather says, no. He was prophesying that there was going to be an earthquake in Utah, and that's why they moved to Rexburg, because Utah wasn't going to be a safe place for them, and the church was going to be relocated to Rexburg, was his prophecy.
Right.
So she knows that Chad and Tammy are moving to Rexburg. She says, please don't buy a house in my ward. What do? They buy a house in her ward.
Oh, interesting.
And he begins to charm everybody in her ward. And they start buying into these beliefs that he has. And she's like, do you not see this guy for what he is? And every time, I had so much sympathy for her, because every time she tried to raise this issue, she was gaslighted as, you're the crazy woman. There's nothing wrong with him.
Wow.
She was gaslighted by people in their family. She was gaslighted by church leadership. She was just really gaslighted a lot. And she, in an interview that she did, she talks about having a conversation with her bishop, and her bishop was like, oh, let's presume he's innocent, etc. And then they find the kids in the backyard, and the bishop's like, oh yeah, I guess you were right. I thought you just didn't like him. And she's like, no, he had issues from day one. So she did an interview with Hidden True Crime Podcast. It's a 3-part interview. It is completely fascinating. I encourage all of you.
I've heard that podcast. I've listened to a couple, but not that interview. So.
I would encourage everybody to go and listen. And the other interesting thing is Matt and Melissa released a podcast this week with an interview that they did. And they interviewed, let me pull this up so I can get the gentleman's name correctly. They interviewed this guy by the name of Taylor Hill, and he was in the Daybell's ward growing up. Matt knows him from BYU, Idaho. I think they're both in the political science department. I can't remember what the connection is. And his name happened to get mentioned in the trial in kind of a passing sort of a thing. It was a phone call, jail phone call that Chad and Lori were having with each other. And so Matt and Melissa did an interview with him, and he was really good friends with Mark, who was the youngest Daybell son. He was on his mission. Mark was on his mission when Tammy died. Taylor Hill was on his mission when Tammy died. They were very close growing up. He has nothing but wonderful glowing things to say about Tammy. He said, she was just very warm and friendly. And Chad was the one that was a little more aloof. He said he never heard any of the teachings from Chad, the out there ones. Everything he ever heard from Chad was mainstream Mormonism. But he said, I was a teenager. How much was I really paying attention? But his interview is very fascinating. Matt and Melissa asked him, do you still have contact with the Daybell kids? And he, to a limited extent, he still has contact with Mark. And they asked, how are the Daybell children being treated in the community? And he said, they've really, to a very large extent, been shunned in the community. Emma and Joe live in Chad's house, so they are in the ward that Taylor's parents are in, and apparently they no longer attend that ward because of how they've been treated, which I have some thoughts on this. I'm going to share my thoughts on this. I know, we are nearly a half hour into the show.
But what a conundrum. Can you imagine what a strain that would be on a ward? Just the whole situation.
Exactly.
How do you handle that? It's
because here is the conundrum how I see it. You want to be a Christ-like person, and you want to love and support and help your ward members. But the evidence in this case against both Chad and Lori, or as I like to call them, the dastardly Daybell duo, is so egregious and outrageous that, there's really no other conclusion one can draw. And I understand the kids not wanting to believe that their father is this awful person who engaged in this thing. But how long can you put blinders on to what reality really is? And I think it is so sad for them, the isolation that they are feeling. But at the same time, I'm like, well, some of that isolation falls on them because they are still choosing to have blinders on. I can certainly understand at first having blinders on and being just like, no way my dad could have done this. I understand that at first.
Yeah.
But as time marches on and as the evidence marches forward, at some point in time, you kind of have to take those blinders off. And what I gathered from all of the extended family members is they would love nothing more than to have a relationship with these 5 Daybell kids. So if these Daybell kids can kind of take their blinders off and kind of say, okay, there was definitely something that happened here, and my dad did some stuff that wasn't cool, I think then that they could repair those relationships with their extended family. And I think they can still support their dad and still love their dad. I don't think the two things are mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
I think they can support and love their dad and have a relationship with him and still acknowledge he did a really heinous thing.
Yeah.
I think you can get to a place of that. I think it would take a lot of work and probably some counseling, but I do. I think it is a conundrum for them being in the community. One thing that Taylor did say in his interview is he said the youngest son, Mark, he's the only one that's not married. He didn't say where he was, but he said he is out of state going to college because he needed to remove himself from that environment. And I'm like, well, so far that's the smartest one I've seen.
I know. If I were them, I'd want to remove myself from this state also.
Exactly. I'd want to go in and file an application to change my last name.